Hi, it's Gita. Welcome to Answer the Question. This is Swamp Watch, our weekly recap of all the major things that happened in the federal government, including the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches. Let's start with the office of the president. There were a number of executive actions in the last week, some of them not that consequential, including denoting September 11th as Patriots' Day and a declaration honoring the memory of Charlie Kirk, who of course was murdered this week. The president also issued an executive order giving the Defense Department 60 days to summarize what the action items would be to revert the Department of Defense back to its original title, which was the Department of War. President Trump wants to revert back to this original title because he believes it gives more weight to his policy of securing peace through strength, with the new name Department of War, signaling more clearly that the United States is willing to use military force to secure peace around the world. The president also issued a memorandum strengthening and doubling down on his commitment to secure the release of Americans who have been detained abroad. This has been really one of President Trump's success stories. He's been very successful securing the release of foreign prisoners, including Americans that were being held by Hamas, Americans held in Russian jails, as well as other places. Another presidential executive order directed the Secretary of Health and Human Services to take actions on the regulation of direct-to-consumer prescription drug advertising, stating that prescription drug advertising often misleads consumers about the benefits versus the risks of prescription drugs, encourages medications over lifestyle changes, interferes in the prescriber-patient relationship, and often advantages expensive prescription drugs over cheaper alternatives. The order asks the Secretary of Health and Human Services to look into further regulations which would govern direct-to-consumer advertising by these pharmaceutical companies. Finally, following an appeals court ruling that upheld a federal court order saying President Trump's application of tariffs had exceeded his legal authority, President Trump issued a new executive order this week that modified the scope of reciprocal tariffs and which established procedures for implementing and modifying trade agreements. That order immediately changes the tariff status of a number of goods, excluding them from the reciprocal tariffs. New items that have been added to the list of exclusions from reciprocal tariffs include certain types of gold, pharmaceutical products, and certain critical minerals. Some items that had previously been excluded have now been re-included in the reciprocal tariffs, including hydroxide, resin, and silicone products. The new order also creates a new potential tariff adjustment for aligned partners list. This list creates new categories of products such as airline parts, generic pharmaceuticals, and certain natural resources for which the president may be willing to apply most favored nation tariff rates, potentially 0%, for any nation that successfully concludes a new trade agreement with the United States. Given the fact that two courts have ruled President Trump's use of emergency powers to enact tariffs as illegal, with that issue likely to be decided by the Supreme Court in November, this new order shows how President Trump is using tariffs as a strategic tool to get better trade agreements in place, and how he's trying to accelerate that prior to that Supreme Court ruling being issued. Turning to the judiciary, the Supreme Court issued a couple of rulings from the emergency docket this week. The Supreme Court left in place a lower court ruling that will allow a transgender student to continue using the boys' bathroom in South Carolina, while a court case filed by the teen continues to make its way through the court system. It was an unsigned order and it doesn't really weigh in on the merits of the case. Instead, their only explanation was that the request to overturn the lower court ruling didn't meet the standards for emergency relief from the Supreme Court. On Friday, several nonprofit groups filed a brief at the court, urging them to keep in place a lower court ruling mandating that the Trump administration release $4 billion in foreign aid that they had previously frozen. The group was arguing that the president does not have unilateral powers to impound billions of dollars in appropriations that Congress has enacted for the general welfare. The Supreme Court hasn't issued a ruling on that emergency order yet, but I think we're likely to see a decision coming soon. The Trump administration has been on a winning streak with the Supreme Court, at least as it comes to the emergency docket. The Supreme Court has sided with the administration 18 times in a row, blocking a lower court ruling that prevented President Trump's policies from going into effect while legal challenges made their way through the court system. So we'll see if that extends to 20, with 2 new cases that are expected to be decided next week. In Congress, there hasn't been much consequential action this week. All eyes have been on the budget, which of course needs to be passed by September 30th to avert a government shutdown. President Trump has asked Republicans to pass a continuing resolution keeping the government funded through December and extending the deadline to pass specific appropriations bills. Many Republicans oppose the continuing resolution, and most Democrats oppose the continuing resolution because they are trying to use the impending budget shutdown as a tool to extract some concessions from Republicans to get some of their priorities funded. Number one among them is a key provision in the Affordable Care Act, which resulted in premium discounts for people who buy their health insurance on the exchange. If that provision is allowed to expire at the end of the year, people who purchase their own health insurance will see double-digit increases in their health insurance premiums next year. And Democrats are demanding an extension of that provision in exchange for votes on the budget. Democrats are also feeling the pressure not to support any kind of Republican budget after they faced extreme backlash earlier in the year when they voted to keep the government open by a narrow margin. On the Republican side, fiscal hawks have some reservations about the budget resolution, especially given 2 recent developments. One is the appeals court ruling that President Trump has enacted tariffs unlawfully. That's now going to the Supreme Court, but if the Supreme Court rules against President Trump's tariffs, that would blow a humongous hole in the Republican budget, which counts on those tariff revenue to offset tax cuts. The second concern is a report released by the Congressional Budget Office on Friday, which shows slowing down of the economy, including slower growth in the gross domestic product, rising unemployment, and rising inflation as a result of President Trump's economic policies. So I think we can expect to hear a lot more about the budget and what the main points of negotiation are and where there may be some opportunities for compromise in the coming week.